Salutations everybody, it is Matty here today, and let me begin this video by congratulating you. You have officially clicked on your first piece of internet content that has nothing to do with Will Smith slapping the shit out of Chris Rock, so you're welcome. With that, ladies and gentlemen, today we have a huge Xbox news update. Last week was GDC, the Game Developers Conference, where game developers gather and share their wisdom with the world. And I do highly recommend some of you out there look into some of the content that was there, not only in this year, but past ones. There's some really interesting scoops on how great games are made. And as someone who's making a game, I just find it so interesting to see these stories being shared and not broadcast as widely. But today's news has less to do with that and more to do with a brand new publishing division that Xbox has announced, their push for Azure cloud-based development, as well as numbers showing just how impactful Game Pass is to the Xbox and PC ecosystem. So there's a lot here that we definitely need to go through, and that's a rarity right now for Xbox, as things have been very, very, very dry for the early part of the year outside of Activision, and it's going to hurt especially for Xbox fans this week, as apparently PlayStation is a-coming. We're hearing about things with Spartacus, PlayStation's Game Pass competitor, that it'll likely be announced this week. We're also hearing about other announcements surrounding that are apparently huge. So we'll see just how much of that delivers. We're staying ready. We'll be talking about it this week as a channel that's talked a lot about Game Pass. I want to see a service that goes toe-to-toe with it in a lot of different ways. I don't think it'll offer the same type of value, but still, it's going to be interesting to see nonetheless. So we'll stay ready. For those of you who are interested in Xbox news and information, when there is that type of stuff hanging around, which again has been rare lately, we do cover it. Consider subscribing. With that, let's start off with this brand new publishing division that was announced recently, and this is a pretty exciting one. We're going to get into exactly why. So this article comes from VGC, where it says, according to Microsoft, the division works with studios to develop cloud-native titles and bring them exclusively to the Xbox ecosystem. The division is led by Kim Swift, who joined Xbox last year as Cloud Gaming Director. In a presentation video aimed at developers, which can be viewed, Swift explained that the division's mandate is to partner with world-class game development teams to develop cloud-native games to bring unprecedented experiences to players that can only be achieved with cloud technology. Now, before we go deeper into this article and more of what Kim Swift had to say about this new cloud gaming division, for those of you who need to put your mind in the right place of like, what is cloud-based game development? Because a lot of this stuff is invisible to us consumers. With the new program that Xbox announced, we'll talk about it later in the video, ID at Azure, they cite a bunch of games that used Azure that many of us probably wouldn't have known any different, like Halo Infinite, Doom Eternal, and I'm like, this used Azure? Okay, that is news to me. So some of it is invisible to us, but there are particular ones that are more visible. One that isn't as well known is Crackdown 3's Wrecking Zone multiplayer. The cloud-based development there was used to do the real-time destruction you would see in that multiplayer. Unfortunately, Crackdown 3 was a bit of a flop, so it didn't really put on full display what the cloud was capable of, and not many people got to experience that. Another good example is Microsoft Flight Simulator. It's how the map is generated, pulling straight from the cloud. So there are instances where we can see that in real time, and apparently, we've learned recently through GDC, sometimes that stuff sits in the background. But this is significant nonetheless because Microsoft is trying to get ahead of what they believe is the future of gaming, cloud-based game development, right? We know that, of course, they're doing Xbox cloud gaming with their streaming through Game Pass, but now they're trying to get ahead of it by setting up not just a team internally at Microsoft, but a whole-on division to support cloud-based development and partnerships within that. And when you think about the rumor of Hideo Kojima potentially working on a cloud-based game with Xbox exclusively, this becomes a little bit more believable because, again, they're setting up a whole division for this to connect developers to the program. So I think that would be the best way to introduce it to people, is not this offshoot multiplayer mode or a game about flying, which, no disrespect to either of them, just I don't think they're in particular something that hardcore gamers would be interested in, where I think of something like Hideo Kojima, which speaks very much to the hardcore gamer, and what he could do with cloud-based development, I think could put on display the potential of that. We'll see in due time, but let's keep reading, where the article continues saying, cloud gaming is still in its infancy, Swift said in her presentation, comparing the new division's position with where Netflix was when it was just starting to move from a disc mailing company to a streaming service. Quote, at the time when Netflix was formed, internet speeds were not what they needed to be in order to send packets fast enough to support streaming. So instead, they sent physical packets in the mail in the form of DVDs, and they had to wait for technology to catch catch up with their vision, but they were ready for it, end quote. Swift says she sees the future of cloud gaming falling into 3 separate categories: ubiquity, cloud AI, and runtime calculations. According to Swift, ubiquity, the ability to stream games on any device even though that wouldn't be powerful enough to run them natively, is the low-hanging fruit for cloud content. Cloud AI, meanwhile, will advance what developers can do by using technology like machine learning, natural language processing, and reinforcement learning. While this could lead to benefits for players in the shape of things like more convincing NPCs, it could also lead to useful tools for developers, such as the ability to create QA bots, which can use machine learning to test games on a huge scale, which is gigantic. Toxicity detection and filters, using machine learning to improve games that have procedurally generated features. Finally, runtime calculations could be used to increase horsepower at runtime, leading to improved graphics rendering, AI agents, randomization for crowd scenes, for example, destruction effects, or as Swift puts it, all the things. So yeah, a lot here, certainly, a lot of potential to improve the game development process. To me, what stood out the most, as I mentioned while reading it, was 100% QA. I think that's what really makes the wheels turn for games. They may be viewed as the bottom rung of the ladder when you look at things, but when you look at an RPG, for example, you're making an RPG, you can have the best story, the best choices, but your gameplay is truly what matters in a manner of speaking, because if the numbers are off on that, let's say you're fighting a boss, he has 999 health, and you're doing 3 damage in an attack, it doesn't matter how great your story is if you're only doing 3 damage per an attack, and that is ruining everything around it, right? Almost a poison within the game. And QA combs through that, combs through the bugs, make sure everything's balanced, make sure everything's well tested. And when you can use a machine on top of that to go through parts of the game to automatically test things, will it substitute the immediate feedback you'd get from an actual person? No, I don't think we'll ever quite get there, but it can speed up some of those processes a little bit in the initial testing when games are prototyping, which I think is great. So there are a lot of tools here that they're working on that improve game development. You can see right from the outset, which I'm excited about. Let's move on to our next beat here, which is Microsoft launching the ID at Azure program. This is from Windows Central Gaming, where they say, after a private testing period, Microsoft has made the ID at Azure program generally available. It is a platform agnostic tool that lets developers create games for console, PC, mobile devices, and virtual reality. Being part of the program gets developers a free Azure PlayFab standard plan, which provides access to PlayFab party services, live ops party services, and other tools. Microsoft also announced the Azure Game Development Virtual Machine. It provides a pre-built game development virtual machine in Azure that has several development tools installed. Using the Azure Game Development Virtual Machine should reduce some of the time and costs associated with setting up test systems for game development. Quote, the goal of ID at Azure is to empower independent developers, explained Nick Ferguson, the program director of ID at Azure. We want you to take advantage of the same services and capabilities used by large teams building some of the most popular games today, many of which are powered by Azure to reach millions of players, end quote. Microsoft will provide ID at Azure program members up to $5,000 in Azure credits. All developers will be able to get $500 of credits, but that figure can go up as devs work with Microsoft on specific projects. Microsoft will also give developers access to a PlayFab standard plan for up to 2 years, which normally costs $100 a month. That includes $400 of monthly meters over PlayFab's free-to-start pricing plan. ID at Azure members will also get access to PlayFab Party Networking, Party Voice and Chat, PlayFab Matchmaking, and PlayFab Lobby. On top of that, Microsoft's Azure Game Development Virtual Machine is now in the public preview. It should make it easier for game creators to jump into development. The tool provides a remote workstation that comes with many game development solutions pre-installed. Because Unreal Engine, Blender, DirectX, and some of the most popular solutions are pre-installed in the Azure Game Development Virtual Machine, game developers can have a server ready to go in minutes. With the solutions already available, studios don't need to have specialty hardware on site or to use the same centralized server to collaborate. Below are the solutions currently available through the Azure Game Development Virtual Machine. Okay, so this may sound like a lot of developer mumbo jumbo, but this is great because it's putting more tools in independent game developers' hands. But when you look at some of the numbers that I've collected here for independent game developers right now in the Xbox ecosystem, you'll see how this order of announcements was very deliberate by Xbox. This information was very deliberate by them because it paints a very clear picture of where the indie scene is at for this ecosystem, where it's going, where game development's going, and how Xbox is trying to be ahead of that curve. And that's a very wise thing to do, especially now in a quiet time where you don't have many games coming out. You may as well, as Xbox always seems to be doing, prepare for the future, right? I swear to God, it's like their Vault Tech, right? When we talk about their exclusives, their acquisitions, everything's future, future, future. I'm excited for when we get to that point that it's happening right there, right then, and we don't have to wait for certain things. But this does bring a lot of promise to the independent scene, a lot of tools available. And let's not ignore the idea that with a lot of remote working currently happening for game development, that having something like ID at Azure, which has those tools effectively based in a server where you can access them at any point, makes it where progress can happen whether you're in the studio, out of the studio. And a lot of teams have adjusted to that, but the setup process seems to be there, is my interpretation. So a lot of good stuff already. And then the last bit here is a bit of a numbers flex by Xbox, but one that I do think is worth getting into. So let's look at this presentation here that happened at GDC, where they talked about Game Pass and the impact of Game Pass on video games and the consumers of those games. So the first thing that they talked about was the broadening funnel for games, the distribution of player lift, which saw an 8.3 times lift in players on average for games in the service. They're also broadening the funnel for day and date games. This is probably the most interesting number here, where they showed large publishers see a 3.5 time increase in players. And then when it comes to ID and Xbox players who are just launching not on Game Pass day and date versus those who are there day and date, 15 times more the player count, which of course is more tantalizing for the multiplayer developers. These numbers are encouraging, but I think they tell a very particular story, and you do need to keep that in mind. But there is more here about spending on the consumer side of things, where they talk about Game Pass members are willing to invest in their experiences. Members spend 50% more than lookalike users. So if you are a Game Pass user, you are spending more. This would make sense. If you are a Game Pass subscriber, I don't think it's hit the complete mainstream yet, where people know about it kind of like Netflix, where most of us who are subscribed to it are already gamers, are very invested in the ecosystem, and plan on playing a lot of games, where we sign up, go into that service, and effectively save a lot of money. The reason why I don't think Game Pass has reached super mainstream levels yet beyond gaming is I don't think they're investing in the right games. They're investing in these quiet multiplayer games that they're hoping pop off. They're not going for the big fish. And I know it takes two to tango. I look at something like Elden Ring. If I were Xbox, I'd be knocking on the door. How much do we got to put out there to get this game in our service? Like, that is something that they should be getting in on immediately, but they're playing safe right now, and I think they need to be at the end of the pop culture movement. And right now, Elden Ring is that pop culture movement. Usually I talk about superhero games and stuff, but I do think they need to get in on the popular stuff, putting that in the service to grow it. But that's a long tangent to bring it back to our original point here of Game Pass members are spending, and that would make sense because you're already invested in games. There is more here, that Game Pass has contributed to the growth of independent developers, where they say independent developers have seen triple-digit growth for their pay-to-play titles when comparing to prior of the launch of Game Pass. Close to 2/3 of growth is driven by Game Pass. So they are indeed adding revenue to the pockets of these independent game developers, which I can imagine many independent game developers are looking at this wondering what ecosystem they're going to. And Xbox, while they are informing their audience here, as I've said for a good number of months now, a lot of these things, like when they went out on the Tokyo Game Show and said, we're working with, I think it was 200 independent creators in Japan right now. And if you're interested, here's our ID at Xbox program. Here's how it works. They're less talking to us, but fans are getting excited because they know what they might get out of it. They're really talking to developers, to publishers, and trying to get a lot of people invested in their ecosystem. They have a lot of energy for ID at Xbox, for Azure, for cloud-based development, and they're trying to share that with the world. I wonder, on just a completely random note, I wonder if PlayStation had this energy for Vita, what this world would be like. I'm sure we'd be in a better place. But anyway, a lot of interesting stuff here for Xbox, and I like where they're heading with a lot of things. Of course, cloud-based development, hearing cloud this, cloud that, does worry me a bit as a physical game collector, but that's why we have Retro Rebound for that space to talk about those types of things. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, What do you think about the latest in Xbox news? Certainly a pretty exciting batch here, but I'm sure that is a statement that will age horribly if PlayStation makes the huge announcements that they're apparently supposed to. Time will tell on that. Let me know what you're thinking in the comments down below. Other than that, follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram. Those links are in the description down below. And a big thank you to all the patrons, all the members who continue to support the hell out of the content here. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.